One question I tend to get a lot is how to create waterfalls in Vue. So what I'm going to be showing you is a couple of different ways how we can create waterfalls for your scenes. You can load in the scene I currently have. You have version 8.4 or higher, and it's called waterfall 2_a_02. So this is a render just in the final mode of just the terrain. There's currently no material on it other than just a very basic color along with a little bit of a bump function tied to the terrain altitude itself and mixed with slope. So first let's take a look at that material. What I've done is connected the procedural terrain altitude with a blender node, and I'm subtracting the slope, which is going to increase intensity of the bump around areas with higher amounts of slope. And then I have the depth set to 1.5. So it does add a little bit of highlight. It does pick up a little more depth. Whether or not that's going to end up being used as we start adding materials, we'll have to see how well that's going to mix together. If you're unfamiliar with using an external dependency, in this case, go ahead and open up the terrain editor and take a look at what's making up the terrain. One of the outputs is a custom dependency output, and it's just the terrain altitude itself. So that is what's connected in the material. This is a really basic setup, so it will render a little quicker because it's not all that complex. Basically what I have are two terrain fractals and one controlling the gain of another. Also using one of my random vector nodes to just generate a random vector. It's kind of like a seed. So for this technique we're going to be looking at, what we're going to do is use the terrain editor to create the waterfalls and also modify the terrain to have places for the waterfalls. So I think I'm going to be placing one around right here, and then probably cutting out a bit of the terrain and having one come out just over here, or maybe cutting it out on this side and having the water come down, and then quite possibly having another area where the waterfall will stream and come down here. Could also add some additional ones up here because it looks like it would mix with the terrain pretty well. So we're going to go ahead and open up the terrain editor, and we can show the entire scene. And the current active camera is this one showing down in the bottom. So if we take a look and kind of match up the terrain editor to be similar to the render camera, we can get an idea of where we need to start placing the waterfalls and what needs to be modified. Now the terrain preview in the editor, when showing the entire scene with the terrain, is much lower quality and a little closer to what you would see in a host application of the integrated version of Xstream. So it doesn't quite give you as much detail. So because of that, what I'm going to do is add an additional material layer. I'm just going to click to add a layer and just cancel it out. Or actually, it doesn't look like I'm able to do that directly within the terrain editor. In the material editor, you can add another layer, hit X, and it'll just create a blank layer. So what I'm going to do is just use one of my dirt materials and change the preview colors so that the original terrain is going to be just kind of green-brown, so a little bit of yellow. And then that dirt material that's really just temporary, I'm going to change it to what's going to be blue, just so we can mark out exactly where we want to have the waterfalls showing. So this is really only just to mark them out, or any areas we might want to have them. I'm going to adjust the brush scale and the brush size. Now, in this case, when I bring down the brush size to the lowest point, it might not be small enough to mark the area we want. So what you can do is create a more limited filter. What I've done is brought the rightmost point to 0.5, and that'll allow you to scale the brush much smaller than the size option, since it is still going to be kind of large at the smallest setting in some cases. So once that is painted in, we can turn off the Show Entire Scene and then get a higher res version of the terrain in order to be able to modify it. If you're not familiar with navigating through the terrain editor, in order to adjust our pivot point, and that's the red dot that is showing up, what that is a projected pivot from the camera, from the center of the camera, onto the object. And what you can do is hold down Shift and double click onto the terrain wherever you want that to show up. So then you can right click to rotate around the terrain, use the zoom wheel, if you have one, mouse wheel, to zoom in and out. And if you want to shift the camera, you can hold down Shift and right click in order to kind of pan. And you can control the focal with Control and right click. And you used to be able to move in and out by holding down Control, Shift, and right click, but it does look like that functionality has been removed. So if you're using the keyboard shortcut reference card from the AZLFX site, located in the Free Stuff section, that function no longer applies, at least in version 8.5, possibly 8.4. So we're going to start manipulating the 2D layer in order to conform the procedural terrain to kind of cut out the areas where the waterfalls are going to be coming out. So right now the terrain size is 512 by 512, which means the two-dimensional layer is 512 by 512. So if you can see some of these areas where the pixels are, it's very jagged. Now the render, the procedural terrain doesn't look like that, but if we start modifying the two-dimensional layer, there's potential that those jagged lines are going to start showing up. So I am going to increase the terrain mesh. So we can go up to the top, hit ×2, double the terrain resolution. So now we're at 1024 by 1024. This is also the resolution of any painted layers and any painted alphas that are applied to the terrain. So we'll get a much higher resolution painted layer if we start painting out those areas if we have a higher resolution 2D layer. And because it is a procedural terrain, the higher the resolution, the more time it is going to take to generate the mesh whenever you open the terrain editor or close it, because there is a refresh that takes place when opening, and then also to close it and apply it to the scene. So depending on the complexity of the procedural, it could take quite a while to update if you're using a high resolution mesh. So we're going to go over here and start in this lower area and just start to cut in the river that's going to be leading up to the spot where the waterfall is going to be. What we can choose to do is set an altitude amount. So if we go to altitude, we can get the picker and just click where we want the lowest point or where we want the waterfall to be in the cut in the terrain. Go back and grab the picker again, bring it up a little bit higher. So now we have this altitude set, and we can use the altitude tool. I'm going to reduce the flow, and we can just start to paint in, and it will be restricted to that altitude. So I'm going to go ahead and create and use a different brush for this, or a different filter, fall off filter. I'm going to edit my filter that is completely flat, grab this right point and set it to -1 on the Y, or actually 0 on the Y, because these filters only go to 0. It will increase the brush size, but also help with the fall off. So right now my brush size is still really quite large. So if I do need to, I can go back to a smaller filter. Since we're looking from below the terrain, we don't need to remove that far back unless you're planning on lifting up a little bit higher to be able to see these river areas. So if you want, you can cut it out a bit further. Otherwise, just kind of worry about the front area. And then I'm going to go ahead and move over to the other layer. Now right now the materials are not showing with the altitude mode on. So I'm going to go and select the dirt material, and now we can see where else we want to have those rivers and the waterfalls. So I'm going to do the same thing as before, select the altitude, sample it a little bit higher than the other ones, and then just go through and we can carve those out. So I'm just going to kind of go along and create these different river areas going up to the points where there's going to be the breaks and the waterfall. And then we can take a look at what we need to do next. I also want to note that while I'm performing an undo operation right now, the higher the resolution of the mesh with the procedural, the longer it's going to take to refresh when you perform an undo, because it is going to go back to the previous version and it does need to regenerate the terrain. It'll also reset whichever camera view you have. So I'm just going to come over to the last river area and set a new sampling, and then I can paint that in really quick. And another thing I want to note is in the newer version of View, the Smooth tool no longer applies to the 2D areas, and it is pretty much strictly a 3D brush now, so that will trigger the 3D mesh. So what we can use instead is the plateaus, and that way we can smooth out some of the edges. So this tool works out pretty well, and you can create some pretty cool stuff with it. Plateaus kind of takes the initial area clicked on and then will equalize the terrain to match that area as you paint. So depending on if you select higher or lower, and it will also continue to sample as you're painting and just kind of even and equalize everything out. So the Plateau tool is also very useful once we start coming down on the face of the terrain in order to subtract away the area where water has been flowing, so it's more realistic. Because we are going to have water erosion, and we don't just want to have the area protruding, and it just wouldn't be very realistic that way. So do want to have it dip down a bit and go in to start basically deciding where the water is going to be flowing. What you can also use this for is to add rocks and other things along the way. And then we'll be able to conform the waterfall to that. We'll take a look at that once we actually start creating the waterfall. So if we also want to go a little bit lower and take care of where the water is going to end up and where it will be flowing to, we can start to use the Plateau Tool. And just kind of adjust the flow. And I'm just going to set up an area down here where the water is going to flow down to, and then continue. If you need a larger subtraction, you can switch to the erase mode and use it inverted, which will lower it. I do suggest a very low flow for this because it will have a very large impact. But it will create a more dramatic effect. And then if it's not really blending right, after you use the inverted raise tool, you can switch back to the Plateau tool and just kind of even things out. So let's go ahead and click OK to apply this to the scene and to the terrain, and we can just take a look at it, how it's currently turning out. And then we can go in and start taking a look at how to create the waterfalls. And the actual water that will be flowing. So I'm just going to go ahead and render this really quick, and we can take a look. So I think the brush size was still a little large, even though the filter was severely clipped. Because we do have a lot of bowing, and I was kind of hoping for something a little more sharper. So I'll probably go back and just kind of correct that. And then we can take a look at what we're basically doing is creating another material to represent water, but that won't be the final output. We are going to be using real geometry for the water, but it will give us a nice map we can use to cut out the terrain. You also note that the dirt material is showing up where those place markers were, so we can clear that out or start to modify that layer and figure out how the material is going to look. Now I'm back in the terrain editor, just starting to draw out a little further where the water is going to be flowing, and just really roughly right now adding in and kind of cutting out using the raise brush set to invert with a very small clipped filter or fall off, just starting to bring all this together. And I am going to go through and clean it up a bit more once it's done. I'm just kind of laying it all out at the moment. But I do want to mention that it is a good idea to kind of cut away around some of the features that already exist within the terrain. So trying to make it flow naturally, plus things like sharp peaks within procedural terrains, once you limit them with the 2D layer, or even the 3D layer, you're going to get some weird seams that are going to show up. So this way, if we just kind of go around certain features, and that's basically what I've done, is kind of had it bounce off different rocks and flow down that way, we'll be able to really keep the consistency and the look of the terrain, keep it a little more realistic. So there's a little bit of jumping between some of the brushes and the different strokes. If you are too far away or also using this limited filter, can do that. But we'll be able to go back through with the plateaus use a larger filter, increase the flow a bit, and just kind of smooth that out. The Plateau Tool does require a bit higher of a fall off to really work well. But that way we can take care of any of these weird areas that are showing up, because we don't want it too bumpy. And how far I'm going to bring them down is really going to depend on how the output render is going to look, and whether or not I want to have them all go down into one larger river. So I think maybe I will bring that down a bit further, and just kind of going around these different features and making them all kind of flow together. So I'm going to go ahead and finish that up, and just kind of the initial shapes for the rivers and the water, and then we can proceed to the next step. And just before I lay out the final river, I do want to note that you can use the clipping on the bottom in order to find out exactly where the lowest point of the terrain is, to give yourself a guide of exactly where the water should be flowing to, which should be the lowest point. And that way we can use that to define a larger water source or a smaller water source, but just kind of see where everything would be flowing to keep it as realistic as possible. And if you want to start out a little higher and keep stepping it down until you reach the final area, that can be really helpful. So it still needs a little bit of cleanup, but you can see where I'm currently at, and just how it's starting to turn out in the render. The stepping that shows up between the brush strokes can be greatly reduced by using or turning off the airbrush mode, especially when working with a pressure-sensitive tablet. In this case, I'm using a Wacom tablet, and with the airbrush mode, it is stepping quite a bit, creating a lot of spacing between the strokes. So turning that off does really help the way you can paint with a Wacom. So I also did start to set it up for if I wanted to have a farther away shot. I am going to go through and just clean it up a tiny bit more. And then we'll go ahead and reset that material layer and start working on the water.